My brother forged our dad's will to leave me with nothing, then smirked and said, "Maybe you imagined it." I just stared at him. That was a year ago. This morning, he was standing outside the courthouse in shackles. My brother forged our father's will and left me with nothing, so I took him to court and left him penniless. My father passed away last year. It was devastating for me because he was the one parent who truly supported me. My brother Dan, 38 million, was always the favorite in the eyes of some relatives because he was charming and good at talking his way into things, even if it meant lying through his teeth. I always knew Dan was selfish, but I never thought he'd stoop this low. Turns out I underestimated him. Dan has been manipulating situations since we were kids. When we were younger, if money went missing from my mom's purse, he'd tell her he saw me take it, and she'd believe him. Later, she'd find the money in his room, but by then, I'd already been punished. When we were teens, our dad bought me a used laptop for school. A week later, it disappeared. Months later, I found out Dan sold it to one of his friends for cash. His excuse? "You weren't using it enough, and I needed the money more than you." Dad scolded him but never cut him off. I think Dad always hoped Dan would grow up. Spoiler, he didn't. Before Dad passed, he told me he had a will. He wanted everything split equally between me and Dan, except for Dad's old house, which he wanted me to have because I'd been living there and taking care of it for years. After the funeral, Dan suddenly started acting cagey about paperwork. He said things like, "You don't need to stress about the legal stuff. I'll handle it." That was my first red flag. A few weeks later, Dan presented Dad's will to the lawyer. According to this will, everything went to him: the house, the savings, even Dad's coin collection. The only thing I supposedly got was an emotional keepsake, a watch worth maybe $50. When I questioned it, Dan smirked and said, "Don't tell me you actually thought Dad wanted you to have the house. You're always so dramatic. Dad knew you couldn't handle big responsibilities." When I told him Dad had said otherwise, he replied, "Memories aren't proof. Maybe you imagined it." That "maybe you imagined it" line made my blood boil. It was classic Dan, make me doubt myself so I'd give up. But this time, I didn't. I told the lawyer I wasn't convinced. Dan rolled his eyes and muttered to the lawyer, "She's just trying to start trouble." It's embarrassing. Thankfully, the lawyer took me seriously and had the will examined. Surprise, surprise, the signature was a forgery. The date on the will was also after Dad's death. When I confronted Dan, he actually laughed. "Fine, you caught me. But you really think a judge will care? Families settle these things privately all the time. If you take me to court, you'll just waste money and look petty." That was the moment I decided, court it is. Dan strutted into court like he was untouchable. He told anyone who would listen that I was a greedy little sister who couldn't accept Dad loved him more. During testimony, he kept smirking at me, as if daring me to beat him. But the evidence spoke for itself. The forensic handwriting expert, the mismatched dates, even text messages where Dan complained to a friend about having to redo the will after Dad's death. The judge didn't just rule in my favor. She called Dan's actions deliberate, deceitful, and malicious. She ordered that all assets be divided as per the original will Dad made, which meant I got the house, my share of the savings, and all personal items Dad left for me. But here's where it gets even better. Because forging a will is a crime, the court also slapped Dan with massive legal fees and restitution costs. By the time everything was over, he had to sell his own home to pay off what he owed. The charming, smooth-talking Dan who always got away with everything, he's now living in a small rented apartment with no savings, no property, and a reputation in the family that's completely destroyed. When he called to make peace a month later, his version of peace was me giving him money so he could get back on his feet. I told him, "You wanted everything, remember? Now you have exactly what you earned, nothing." Then I hung up. But last night, I went to log into my online banking, and my password didn't work. When I finally got in after resetting it, my stomach dropped. Every account was empty. My savings, checking, even the emergency fund I kept separate, all gone. Over $300,000 just vanished overnight. I called the bank immediately, but their fraud department was closed until morning. I didn't sleep at all, just sat there staring at the screen and refreshing the page like the money might somehow come back. At 7 a.m. sharp, I was at the bank's door when they opened. The manager took one look at my accounts and called the police herself. Within 2 hours, I was sitting in a small room at the FBI field office talking to Special Agent James Wright about wire fraud. He pulled out a thick folder and slid it across the table to me. Inside were transcripts of messages between Dan and someone named Roy, dating back 3 months. They were talking about me, calling me the sister problem, and discussing something they called the final solution to their money troubles. James told me they'd been watching Dan since the civil trial ended because they suspected he might do something desperate. They just hadn't moved fast enough to stop him from stealing my money. I signed papers letting them monitor my phone and email in case Dan tried to contact me again. James said they needed to sweep Dad's house before I could go back there because if Dan was desperate enough to steal this much, he might have left other surprises. 2 days later, the tech team found keystroke logging software on my home computer that had been recording every password I typed for months. They also found a GPS tracker stuck under my car that showed Dan had been watching everywhere I went. I had to hire a cybersecurity expert to clean all my devices while I stayed in a hotel downtown. That's when Tom Bradley called me. Tom was Dad's best friend since high school, and he'd heard about the theft from Marcus. He said Dad had shown him the real will 6 months before he died because he was worried Dan might try something. Tom had a notarized copy in his safe deposit box at his bank. I drove straight to Tom's house that afternoon. He handed me the notarized will along with a letter Dad had written expressing his fears about Dan's gambling debts. Dad wrote that Dan owed money to dangerous people, and he was scared Dan would do something desperate to get cash. My father had known what Dan was capable of and tried to protect me, but it wasn't enough. Rachel Torres, the forensic accountant Marcus hired, called with more bad news. She discovered Dan had opened 3 different bank accounts in my name over the past year, using documents he stole from Dad's house during the funeral. Each account had been set up to make the theft look like I was moving my own money around. A week after the theft, I finally went back to Dad's house with a police escort. Everything looked normal, but the whole place felt wrong, like Dan's presence was still there somehow. In Dad's study, I found his journal hidden behind some old books on the top shelf. Page after page documented every time Dan asked for money, every lie he told, every manipulation going back 20 years. Dad had been keeping track of it all. Then Dan called from a blocked number while I was reading Dad's journal. His voice was cold and flat when he said I should have just accepted the watch. He said now that I'd involved the feds, everything had changed, and I had no idea who he owed money to. He hung up before I could say anything, but the FBI was recording the whole call. James played back the enhanced audio the next day, and in the background we could hear casino sounds and someone announcing Table 43. The FBI's gambling task force identified it as a specific illegal casino in Chicago that had connections to organized crime. That's when James sat me down and explained the real situation. Dan owed over $800,000 to a crime syndicate that ran illegal gambling operations across the Midwest. He'd been using Dad's death and the inheritance as collateral to buy himself more time with these people. When he lost the civil case and had to pay me restitution, his timeline suddenly moved up and he got desperate. Marcus called me that same afternoon and said he was filing emergency motions to freeze any assets Dan might have hidden away somewhere. The FBI started working with organized crime units in Chicago since that's where most of these gambling operations were based. I sat in Marcus's office while he made calls and filled out paperwork, and it hit me that this wasn't just about a forged will anymore. Dan had put both our lives in danger by getting mixed up with these people. 3 days later, Rachel called with more bad news. She'd found a shell company Dan created using Dad's old business contacts as references. He'd been moving money through it for 2 years, long before Dad even got sick. She went through all the records and figured out he'd stolen over $1.2 million total from different family members and some of Dad's former clients. He'd been running different schemes on all of them: fake investments, bogus loans, even selling property that wasn't his. Marcus set up an appointment with a therapist who worked with people dealing with family financial abuse. I didn't want to go, but he said it would help with the case. The therapist was nice enough, and she explained that Dan's behavior was pathological, not personal. She said his gambling addiction made him see everyone as potential sources of money, not as people. Understanding it didn't make me feel any better about what he'd done, though. Linda from the bank called the next morning with urgent news. Dan had shown up at the branch trying to get into the safety deposit box Dad left me. There's something odd about Dan showing up at the bank trying to get into that safety deposit box right now. Makes me wonder what he thinks is in there that's worth a risk when the FBI is already watching him. He had forged documents saying he was the executor of the estate. Security stopped him when they recognized his face from the alerts Linda had sent out. When they called the police, Dan ran out the back door and disappeared. The FBI issued an arrest warrant right away, making him officially a fugitive. James called and told me to come to the police station immediately. When I got there, they explained the FBI had intercepted messages between members of the crime syndicate, talking about using me to get to Dan. They were putting me under protective custody starting right then. 2 federal marshals would be stationed at Dad's house where I was still living. My normal life was completely gone. 1 week later, at 3 in the morning, the motion sensors at Dad's house went off. The marshals caught a man trying to break in through the back door. It wasn't Dan, but someone the syndicate had sent to leave a message. When they searched him, they found photos of me going to work, shopping for groceries, even sitting in my car at a red light. He had a whole list of places I went regularly and what times I was usually there. The FBI moved me to a secure apartment the next day while they kept looking for Dan. James sat me down and explained they were treating this as full organized crime involvement now, which changed everything about how they'd handle it. He said Dan had crossed lines that put us both in serious danger, and they were bringing in federal resources to deal with it. In the safe house, I had nothing to do but go through Dad's things that the marshals had brought from the house. I found his journal and started reading more carefully. There were entries going back years about trying to get Dan help for his gambling problem. Dad had paid for rehab twice and bailed him out of debt more times than I could count. His last entry broke my heart. He wrote that he'd enabled Dan for too long, and the will was his last attempt to protect me from my brother's problems. Rachel kept working on tracking down everything Dan had stolen. She found out he'd been selling family heirlooms and Dad's collectibles through black market dealers for months. She tracked Dad's coin collection, worth $200,000, to a dealer in Detroit who'd bought it for $20,000. The dealer agreed to work with the FBI in exchange for immunity from prosecution. 2 weeks into my time at the safe house, Tom came to visit with boxes of documents he'd been keeping safe. He said Dad had asked him to hold on to them years ago. When we went through them, we found records showing Dan had stolen from our grandparents' estate 15 years earlier. Dad had covered it up to protect the family's reputation and keep Dan out of jail. The pattern went back so much further than any of us had realized. 3 days later, my secure phone buzzed with an alert from the FBI monitoring system, and when I opened it, my hands started shaking. Dan had sent an email from some encrypted account with a subject line that just said, "You owe me." The message was short but made my blood run cold. He wrote that he knew where I was, that the marshals couldn't protect me forever, and if I didn't wire him $500,000 within 72 hours, he'd make sure his problems became my problems permanently. James Wright called within minutes, already tracing the email to a cyber cafe in Indiana, but by the time state police got there 40 minutes later, Dan was long gone. The security footage showed him leaving with a woman nobody recognized at first, some blonde in her 40s who turned out to be someone he'd met in an online gambling support group. She'd been helping him hide for weeks, moving him between motels and using her credit cards to keep him off the grid. Marcus came to the safe house the next morning with a stack of legal documents and a grim expression on his face. He explained they were building a RICO case against Dan now, that this went way beyond simple theft into organized fraud, money laundering, and extortion. The charges alone could put Dan away for 20 years or more, and despite everything he'd done, some part of me still saw my broken older brother, who used to sneak me candy when Mom said no. 2 weeks passed before the next development, when we all had to go to federal court for a preliminary hearing to freeze any assets Dan might still have hidden. His lawyer showed up claiming Dan wanted to negotiate, presenting this ridiculous deal where Dan would return half the stolen money if all charges were dropped. Judge Hayes actually laughed out loud before denying it and adding obstruction of justice to Dan's growing list of charges. That afternoon, Wright pulled me aside in the courthouse hallway and dropped another bomb on me. The FBI's organized crime unit had been building a case against Dan's creditors for years, and my brother's theft had given them the opening they needed to move forward. They offered me full witness protection if I'd testify, but that would mean leaving everything behind, starting over with a new name in a new city where nobody knew me. I spent the next 3 weeks in that safe house trying to decide what to do, when at 2 in the morning my secure phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was Dan, and he was sobbing so hard I could barely understand him at first. He kept saying they were going to kill him, that he had 48 hours to pay, or they'd start cutting pieces off him. Before I could even respond, I heard shouting in the background, the sound of something heavy hitting flesh, and then the line went dead. The FBI traced the call call to a warehouse in Gary, Indiana, and had a tactical team there within 2 hours, but they found only blood on the concrete floor and signs of a struggle. The lab confirmed it was Dan's DNA, but he was gone without any other trace. James was blunt when he called me with the update, telling me Dan was either dead already or wishing he was because these people didn't play games. For 3 days, I heard nothing, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, just sat there torn between anger at what he'd done and terror about what was happening to him. The marshals tried to distract me with movies and card games, but I kept checking my phone every few minutes, expecting either a ransom demand or a call saying they'd found his body. Then Rachel called with unexpected news that she'd found $300,000 Dan had hidden in cryptocurrency wallets under fake names. She was working with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit to recover it, and she thought it might be enough to keep Dan alive if his creditors were willing to negotiate. 5 days after he disappeared, Dan surfaced in a hospital in Detroit, beaten so badly the doctors said it was a miracle he was conscious. He'd traded information about his creditors' entire operation for his life, giving the FBI names, addresses, account numbers, everything they needed to take down the whole network. James flew me to Detroit under heavy guard, explaining this was my one chance to see Dan before he entered witness protection permanently. The hospital smelled like bleach and fear when I walked through those automatic doors in Detroit. James had 2 agents flanking me while another pair swept the hallways ahead of us, their hands never far from their weapons. We took an elevator to the 4th floor where more FBI agents stood guard outside room 412. Inside, machines beeped steadily around the bed where Dan lay with his face swollen purple and black, one eye completely shut, lips split in 3 places, and bandages wrapped around his ribs. "I'm sorry," he whispered through cracked lips when he saw me. The words hung there between us while I stared at the IV dripping into his arm and the handcuffs chaining him to the bed rail. He started talking then, slowly at first, about how he'd planned everything the day Dad went into the hospital for his heart surgery, seeing it as his only way to pay off the $300,000 he owed to people who broke fingers for missed payments. His voice cracked when he admitted he'd practiced Dad's signature for weeks before Dad even died, copying it from old checks and documents until he could do it perfectly. My hands gripped the chair arms so hard my knuckles went white. Dan shifted painfully and pulled out his phone, showing me audio files dated months back. "I recorded everything for insurance," he said quietly. The FBI tech specialist took the phone and started playing the recordings right there in the room. Voices discussing which judge they owned in Milwaukee, how they'd made another debtor disappear in Lake Michigan, the politicians they had on payroll. James's eyes went wide as name after name came through the tiny speaker. 1 week later, I sat in a safe house conference room while Marcus spread legal documents across the table, explaining how Dan's cooperation meant he'd probably get 12 years instead of 25, but the stolen money was now evidence in a federal racketeering case. The coffee in my cup had gone cold hours ago. Marcus pointed to forms showing the money might be tied up for 3 to 5 years minimum while the case worked through the system. Tom showed up the next afternoon carrying a cardboard box from Dad's house, setting photo albums on the kitchen counter of the safe house. We flipped through pictures from Disney World when Dan was 10 and I was 4, both of us grinning with mouse ears on our heads. There was Dan at his high school graduation, Dad's arm around his shoulders, both of them looking so proud. Christmas morning photos showed Dan helping me open presents when I was too small to manage the wrapping paper myself. "Your father loved both of you," Tom said softly, pointing at a picture of Dad teaching Dan to ride a bike. My throat felt tight looking at that little boy who became someone I didn't recognize. Marcus's phone rang at 2 in the morning 3 days later, a blocked number that turned out to be a lawyer representing what he called concerned parties who wanted to make a deal. Dan playing criminal informant like it's a get-out-of-jail-free card, trading his buddies' secrets for a lighter sentence while handcuffed to a hospital bed. Talk about loyalty among thieves going right out the window. They'd forgive Dan's debts and guarantee my safety if I refused to testify, the lawyer explained in a smooth voice that made my skin crawl. Marcus put him on speaker so James could record it. "They're scared," Marcus explained after hanging up, showing me transcripts of Dan's recordings that mentioned senators, federal judges, and a police commissioner. We filed our refusal to their offer through official channels the next morning, knowing we'd just painted bigger targets on our backs. 6 weeks after Dan stole everything, James called a press conference announcing 17 arrests including 2 city councilmen, a state senator's chief of staff, and the owner of 3 legitimate businesses that were actually money laundering fronts. Dan's recordings had given them enough probable cause for search warrants that uncovered ledgers, more recordings, and even a murder weapon used in a killing from 2 years ago. "Your brother's cooperation is unprecedented," James told me privately afterward, admitting Dan had given them details about 43 different crimes, including 3 murders they'd never connected to the syndicate. The FBI finally cleared Dad's house 7 weeks after the theft, installing new locks, security cameras, and an alarm system connected directly to their response team. I walked through the front door and saw Dad's recliner still facing the TV, his coffee mug on the side table, his reading glasses on the arm of the chair like he'd just stepped out for a minute. The smell of his cologne still lingered in his bedroom. I stood in the kitchen where he'd made pancakes every Sunday morning and knew I couldn't live here anymore, not with everything that had happened. I called a realtor that afternoon. Dan's arraignment at the federal courthouse downtown drew media attention after the arrests made headlines. They brought him in through a side entrance, but I still saw him in his orange jumpsuit, hands and feet shackled, shuffling to the defendant's table. When the judge read the charges, Dan said guilty to each one without hesitation, his voice flat and empty. The prosecutor recommended 12 years with possibility of reduction to 8 for continued cooperation. Dan just nodded. Rachel called that evening with news that she'd traced another $200,000 through shell companies Dan had set up, bringing the total recovered to $500,000. She'd also found something else in her investigation: life insurance policies Dan had taken out on both me and Dad 18 months ago, each worth $2 million with himself as sole beneficiary. The policies required documentation of accidental death or death during a crime for the highest payout. My appointment with the FBI recommended therapist was in a bland office building downtown where I sat on a beige couch staring at a painting of a lighthouse. "I feel guilty for testifying against him," I admitted after 20 minutes of silence. She adjusted her glasses and reminded me that Dan had made his choices long before I made mine, that protecting myself wasn't betrayal. "He betrayed family first," she said gently. "You're just refusing to be his victim." The words stuck with me as I left her office and and walked to my car where 2 marshals waited to escort me back to the safe house. 2 months crawled by with court dates and depositions filling every week until the pre-trial hearing arrived on a cold Tuesday morning. The courtroom smelled like old wood and floor wax when I walked in with Marcus at my side. Dan's gambling buddy's lawyer stood up and pointed at me while telling the judge I was part of the whole thing, that I knew about Dan's debts and helped stage the theft for insurance money. Marcus jumped up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. He pulled out folder after folder showing every email I sent to the FBI, every document I gave them, timestamps proving I reported the theft within hours of finding out. The judge's face got redder with each accusation until she slammed her gavel and told the defense lawyer one more baseless claim would get him sanctioned. 3 days later, James called to tell me they caught the woman from Dan's gambling support group at the Canadian border with fake passports and $20,000 in cash. She broke down during questioning and admitted everything. How Dan taught her to create shell companies, how he promised they'd run away together with my inheritance money, how she believed him when he said I didn't deserve it anyway. Another person Dan used and threw away like trash. The FBI agent interviewing her said she cried for 2 hours straight when she realized Dan never loved her. I started going to meetings for families of gambling addicts at a church basement downtown where the coffee was terrible, but the stories were worse than mine. A woman named Carol told us her brother took loans against their mom's house while she was dying of cancer. An older man said his son emptied his granddaughter's college fund and spent it all on sports betting in one weekend. We sat in metal folding chairs passing tissues around while people shared how addiction turned their loved ones into strangers who would steal anything. The support helped, but nothing prepared me for Dan's creditors' trial starting 6 weeks later. I sat in the witness box describing the night those men tried to break down my door, how I hid in my bathroom with a baseball bat shaking so hard I could barely hold it. Dan appeared on a TV screen from wherever they were hiding him, his face thinner and older looking as he listed names, dates, murders the syndicate ordered, politicians they owned, judges they bought. The defense lawyers attacked both of us the next day, calling Dan a compulsive liar trying to save himself and me, a bitter sister inventing stories for sympathy. Marcus objected 17 times in 1 hour, and the judge sustained most of them, but the lawyers kept pushing, kept trying to make the jury doubt everything. After my testimony ended, 2 marshals rushed me out a side door and into a black SUV because they'd intercepted communications about a hit ordered on both Dan and me by a syndicate member still on the run. They drove me to a new safe house 3 states away where I spent the next month staring at beige walls and trying to work on my laptop while my concentration fell apart. My boss called to check in, but we both knew I couldn't keep missing deadlines and video calls. Tom emailed me screenshots of family Facebook posts where my aunt called me heartless for not helping Dan with his gambling debts, where cousins said real family would never involve courts and police. Half of them supported me, but the other half thought I should have just given Dan money to make his problems go away. Rachel took the stand 2 weeks into the trial with boxes of evidence showing Dan stole from everyone he could reach. She walked the jury through bank records proving he took $800,000 from Dad's estate, $400,000 from elderly clients at his old job, $300,000 from family friends who trusted him with investments, plus everything from my accounts. The prosecutors gasped when she said the total reached nearly $2 million. Even Dan's own lawyer looked shocked at the number. James called me that night to say 3 syndicate members arrested in other states wanted to make deals and would testify about the organization's structure. He said Dan's recordings were like dominoes falling, each piece of evidence leading to more arrests and more people willing to talk to save themselves. 2 weeks later, the Marshal Service set up a secure video call with Dan from his safe house location. The screen flickered on, and there he was, sitting in some plain room with white walls and no windows. He'd lost weight, and his face looked older, like he'd aged 5 years in just a few months. His eyes had dark circles under them, but they weren't darting around anymore like when he was using. He started talking right away about how sorry he was, how he never meant for things to go this far, how the gambling got its hooks in him, and he couldn't stop even when he wanted to. I told him I was glad he was still breathing, but that didn't mean I forgave him. The call lasted 10 minutes before the marshals cut it off. 4 months after Dan stole everything from me, the syndicate trial finally reached its verdict in federal court. I sat in the back row watching as the judge read guilty on every single count for all 17 members they'd caught. The sentences ranged from 10 years for the lower guys to life without parole for the 3 at the top who'd ordered hits on people who couldn't pay. The judge thanked me and Dan by name for our cooperation and said our testimony was crucial to getting justice. Marcus squeezed my shoulder when it was over, but I just felt empty inside, like winning didn't fix what was broken. With the syndicate locked up, the FBI told me I could finally leave witness protection and go back to my regular life, though nothing about my life felt regular anymore. Marcus helped me fill out all the paperwork to recover what money they could find and trace through the syndicate's accounts. The process would take months, and I'd probably never see all of it, but at least I could start rebuilding. I drove out to Forest Hill Cemetery on a cold Tuesday morning to visit Dad's grave for the first time since this whole mess started. The headstone was covered in dead leaves that I brushed away with my hand. I sat on the cold ground and told him everything, about Dan forging the will, about the theft, about the syndicate and the trial, and how scared I'd been. I told him I'd protected what he left me, but I couldn't save Dan from himself. The cemetery was quiet except for some crows calling in the trees. 3 days later, I was back in the courthouse for Dan's sentencing hearing. He stood up in his orange jumpsuit and read a statement about his gambling addiction, how it started with $20 bets and turned into him owing hundreds of thousands to dangerous people. Life insurance policies on family members 18 months before all this started. Dan's gambling buddy trying to pin this whole mess on the sister who exposed everything makes me wonder what other plans were already in motion that we're just now learning about. He accepted responsibility for everything and asked for the court's mercy. Judge Hayes sentenced him to 10 years with possibility of parole in 7 if he stayed clean and kept cooperating. They'd put him in a special witness protection unit in federal prison where the syndicate couldn't reach him. When it was my turn to give my victim impact statement, I stood at the podium and looked right at Dan. I talked about losing not just money but my sense of safety, my trust in family, my belief that blood meant something. I said my brother died the day he forged that will, and the man in orange was a stranger wearing his face. Dan put his head down and his shoulders shook like he was crying. A week after the sentencing, I finally went back to Dad's house to get it ready to sell. Everything felt wrong there, knowing Dan had bugged the place. No knowing he'd sat outside watching me, knowing every room held memories of betrayal now instead of family. I called an estate sale company and told them to handle everything because I couldn't stand being in those rooms anymore. Rachel came by my apartment with her final report printed out in a thick folder. She'd traced and recovered about $750,000, but $400,000 was gone forever, probably spent on gambling debts or hidden in accounts we'd never find. After all the legal fees and expenses, I'd end up with about $500,000, less than what Dad wanted me to have, but enough to start over. She'd done everything she could, and I thanked her for not giving up even when it looked hopeless. A month into his sentence, a letter arrived from Dan written on prison stationery. 10 pages of his messy handwriting detailing every lie he'd told since we were kids, every theft, every manipulation, every time he'd blamed me for something he did. He wrote about stealing my birthday money when I was 8, about telling our parents I was sneaking out when it was really him, about taking Dad's watch collection and selling it piece by piece while Dad was sick. He said he needed me to know the whole truth even if I could never forgive him. Reading it felt like drowning and breathing at the same time. My therapist helped me work through the letter during our next session, explaining that Dan was trying to make amends the only way he could from prison. She said I didn't have to forgive him or even respond, but acknowledging his effort might help me move forward. I decided to write back just once to tell him I got his letter, and I was working on healing. 5 months passed before Tom called saying he wanted to help me go through the last boxes of Dad's things still stored in his garage. We spent that Saturday afternoon sorting through old photo albums and paperwork when Tom pulled out a small box labeled "For My Kids" in Dad's handwriting. Inside were 2 USB drives with our names on them. Tom plugged mine into his laptop and Dad's face filled the screen, recorded just weeks before he died. He looked tired but smiled as he told me how proud he was of the woman I'd become and how he knew I'd take care of the house he was leaving me. Then he mentioned hoping Dan would finally get help for his gambling problem that had gotten worse over the years. Tom played Dan's video next, and we both sat there stunned as Dad begged him to stop betting on sports and poker games, saying he'd noticed money missing from his accounts but still loved him anyway. The estate sale 2 weeks later turned into something bigger when buyers started recognizing items they'd already bought from Dan months before Dad even died. One woman brought back Dad's military medals she'd purchased from Dan for $200, refusing to keep them once she learned they were stolen. Another man returned an antique pocket watch collection worth thousands that Dan had sold him, claiming they were his own inheritance from our grandfather. By the end of that day, we'd recovered 14 items Dan had stolen and sold, each one showing how desperate he'd been for quick cash. Rachel helped me use part of the recovered money to set up a scholarship fund at Dad's old college, naming it after him to create something good from all this mess. The university scheduled the announcement for their spring ceremony and asked me to speak about Dad's legacy. My boss called that same week with unexpected news about a senior position opening in our Seattle office, offering me the promotion if I could relocate by summer. I accepted immediately, needing to get away from this city where every street reminded me of betrayal and loss. The prison video call from Dan came 3 days before I listed the house, his face thinner but calmer as he talked about his therapy sessions. He said his therapist was helping him understand why he'd always taken from others, how the gambling had started as excitement but turned into desperation he couldn't control. I listened without responding much, wanting to believe he could change but knowing I couldn't risk trusting him again. The house sold in just 2 weeks to a couple with 3 young kids who loved the big backyard and the workshop Dad had built in the garage. I watched them measure rooms for their furniture and talk about painting the kitchen yellow, feeling both sad and relieved that new memories would replace the old ones there. While packing for Seattle, I found the watch Dan had tried to leave me in his fake will, the one he called an emotional keepsake worth $50. It was actually Dad's favorite Omega he'd worn every day for 30 years, worth more in memories than money. I wrapped it carefully and put it in my carry-on bag, taking back its meaning from Dan's twisted gesture. Marcus called that night with news that made everything clearer about Dan's crimes. Dan's accomplice had agreed to testify about 3 other elderly clients of Dad's accounting firm that Dan had approached with investment scams after Dad died. 2 of them had been suspicious enough to refuse, but one had almost given Dan $50,000 before his daughter intervened. Marcus said the prosecutor would use this pattern to show Dan's theft from me wasn't an isolated incident but part of a bigger plan. The scholarship ceremony at Dad's college felt like the first positive thing in months, as I stood at the podium talking about his integrity and generosity. I never mentioned Dan or the trial, focusing instead on how Dad had helped dozens of small business owners with free tax advice when they couldn't afford an accountant. The first scholarship recipient was a young woman named Maria, studying social work with plans to counsel gambling addicts, which felt strangely appropriate given everything that had happened. My last therapy session before the move focused on something I hadn't expected, forgiving myself for not seeing Dan's problems sooner. The therapist reminded me that trusting family wasn't weakness, and that Dan's choices to steal and lie were his alone, not failures on my part for believing in him. 2 days before my move, I was packing boxes when the TV caught my attention with breaking news about the syndicate Dan testified against. The reporter stood outside the courthouse explaining how Dan's testimony helped solve 3 murders from 5 years ago, giving closure to families who'd been waiting for answers. I sat on my half-packed couch watching interviews with crying relatives thanking the prosecution team and their key witness, my brother the thief who'd stolen everything from me, but somehow managed to help other families find peace. Tom threw me a going-away party the next night at his house, filling his backyard with people who'd stood by me through the trial. My aunt who'd initially defended Dan didn't show up, neither did my cousins who thought I was being too harsh, but the people who mattered were there, raising glasses to my fresh start in Seattle. The drive to Seattle took 3 days, and on the second day I stopped for gas in Montana, right next to a casino with flashing lights visible from the highway. I walked inside just to see what had grabbed Dan so hard, and the second I stepped through those doors the sounds hit me like a wall, bells ringing and machines beeping and people hunched over slot machines feeding in bill after bill. The whole place felt designed to trap you, from the lack of windows to the free drink servers kept bringing to players, and I understood for the first time how someone already hurting could lose themselves completely in this artificial world of false hope. I left after 10 minutes and drove another 6 hours straight. My first night in the Seattle apartment, while I was still surrounded by boxes, Marcus called with news that made me drop a pizza slice I was eating. Dan had been attacked in prison despite being in protective custody. Someone someone connected to the syndicate had gotten to him during a transfer between buildings, breaking 3 of his ribs and his nose before guards pulled them off. Marcus said they were moving him to an even more secure facility 2 states away, where syndicate connections couldn't reach him. Part of me felt nothing when I heard it, like my emotions for Dan had finally shut off completely. But another part felt sick thinking about him bleeding on a prison floor. A week later, I started my new job at a marketing firm downtown, introducing myself as just another transplant from the Midwest, telling my new coworkers nothing about the past year except that I'd recently lost my father. Nobody knew about Dan or the trial or the theft. Nobody looked at me with pity or judgment, and for the first time in months, I could just be a normal person building a career. The anonymity felt like taking off a heavy coat I'd been wearing for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like without it. 2 weeks into the job, James called while I was making dinner, and his voice had that careful tone that meant bad news. One of the syndicate members had escaped during a hospital transfer after faking chest pains, and while James insisted they didn't think I was in any danger since the guy was probably fleeing the country, I should stay aware of my surroundings. Plot twist worthy of a crime show finale. Dan's testimony solving murders while he's dodging prison shanks, and somehow our narrator ends up touring a casino like she's researching the enemy that stole her brother's soul. The fear I thought I'd left in Milwaukee came rushing back, making me double-check my apartment locks and look over my shoulder walking to work. Seattle suddenly felt less like a safe new start and more like a place where I was alone if something went wrong. Rachel sent her final invoice the next day with paid in full, stamped across it in red ink, and a handwritten note at the bottom that said, "My father would be proud of my courage." She'd recovered more money than anyone thought possible, and never gave up even when the trail went cold, working weekends to trace Dan's gambling connections and hidden accounts. I framed her note and hung it in my new apartment as a reminder that some people keep their word and do their jobs with integrity, even when things get complicated. 2 weeks into Seattle life, I joined a hiking group to meet people, and on our first trail up to Rattlesnake Ledge, I told them I was from Milwaukee and had recently lost my father, nothing else. The simplicity of that truth without Dan's crimes hanging over it felt like freedom, just being someone working through normal grief instead of the person whose brother stole everything. We hiked for 3 hours, and nobody asked for details, just offered sympathy and changed the subject to the beautiful view. 3 days later, James called again, but this time his voice was lighter, almost cheerful. The escaped syndicate member had been caught at the Mexican border trying to cross with fake documents, clearly running away rather than hunting anyone connected to the case. James officially closed my file, telling me after 7 months of looking over my shoulder I was finally, completely safe to live my life without fear. 8 months after Dan first emptied my accounts, Marcus forwarded me a letter from Dan that he'd vetted for any legal issues. Dan wrote that he'd arranged to donate his prison work earnings to gambling addiction programs, which wouldn't be much money since prison jobs paid almost nothing, but he wanted to do something. His letter ended with one line that actually made me pause while reading it in my Seattle kitchen with rain hitting the windows. 3 weeks passed before the FBI agent called to say they'd recovered the last box of Dad's stuff from Dan's storage unit. I drove to the federal building downtown where the agent handed me a cardboard box that smelled like dust and old paper. Inside were Dad's coin collection in its leather case, his military medals wrapped in tissue paper, and photo albums I thought were gone forever. I picked up Dad's Purple Heart medal and held it in my palm, feeling its weight. The agent told me Dan had tried to sell these things to a pawn shop, but the owner got suspicious and called the cops. Back in my apartment, I spread everything out on the kitchen table and went through each item slowly. The coins Dad had collected since he was 12, his service photos from Vietnam, pictures of him and Mom on their wedding day. Dan hadn't just stolen money, he'd tried to steal our whole family history, but he failed because these things survived and came back to me. That night, I sat down at my computer and typed a letter to Dan in prison. Not a long one, just a few sentences acknowledging I'd gotten his letters and seen his efforts to change. I wrote that I hoped he'd succeed in turning his life around, but we could never be family again. This was goodbye. I printed it, signed it, put it in an envelope, and mailed it the next morning. The weight that lifted off my shoulders felt like dropping a 100-pound backpack I'd been carrying for months. 2 months later, Tom called to say he was coming to Seattle for a conference and wanted to see me. He showed up at my apartment with a small box, and inside was Dad's watch, the one Dan had stolen and pawned. Tom had tracked it down through 3 different pawn shops and paid way too much to get it back. He'd had it cleaned and repaired and engraved on the back with "Integrity Survives" in small letters. We drove out to the pier at sunset with a small urn of Dad's ashes I'd kept. Tom and I stood at the railing watching the water turn gold and orange as the sun went down. We opened the urn together and let Dad's ashes scatter into Puget Sound while seagulls called overhead. Tom put his hand on my shoulder and said Dad would be proud I survived everything Dan put me through. We stayed until the last bit of light faded from the sky. On the 1-year anniversary of Dan emptying my accounts, I took the money from selling Dad's house and used it to start a family financial abuse prevention program through a local nonprofit. The director, a woman who'd been through something similar with her sister, showed me statistics about how most victims never get justice or their money back. She said my story gave other survivors hope that they could fight back and win. We set up workshops and support groups and a hotline for people going through what I went through. 6 months after that, I met someone at my new job at a tech company downtown. His name was Michael, and he worked in a different department, but we kept running into each other at the coffee machine. He was quiet and steady and never pushed when I didn't want to talk about things. When he finally asked about my family over lunch one day, I just said my father had passed and I was estranged from my brother. He nodded and changed the subject to weekend hiking plans. Over the next few months, we went on those hikes and had dinners, and slowly I let him into my life. Trust wasn't dead, just very careful now. Marcus sent me an update about Dan being in therapy and attending NA meetings in prison and teaching other inmates to read. He wrote that Dan seemed genuinely committed to changing this time. I read the letter once, filed it in a folder, and didn't respond. Dan's redemption was his journey to take, not mine to watch or help with. The gambling addiction support group I'd attended during the worst of everything sent me a thank you card signed by 20 people. 3 families had sought help before hitting crisis after hearing my story. One woman wrote that her brother entered treatment after she shared what happened to me. Some good had come from the nightmare after all. On what would have been Dad's 70th birthday, I walked down to the pier at sunset wearing his restored watch. The water was calm, and the mountains were clear across the sound. I told him about the scholarship recipients, the families helped by the prevention program, all the people who'd found strength in our story. I whispered that I'd protected what really mattered and his integrity had survived through me. The watch caught the last light as I turned to walk home. 2 years after that morning, I found my accounts empty. A letter arrived from the first scholarship recipient. She was graduating with her degree and planned to work with families affected by gambling addiction. She wrote that my father's legacy lived on through everyone he was helping, even though he was gone. I framed her letter and hung it next to Rachel's note and Dad's photo on my living room wall. In my Seattle apartment with its view of the water, surrounded by new friends and Michael who'd become more than just someone I was careful with, I'd built something Dan couldn't steal. My life wasn't defined by betrayal anymore, but by what I'd done with the pieces afterward. The brother who forged our father's will was in prison. Maybe getting better, maybe not, but definitely gone from my world. I wasn't his victim or his sister anymore. I was just myself, finally free. Thanks for sticking with me through all these twists and turns. Definitely made the ride more interesting with your company. Like the video? It helps more than you think.